1989's Batman was such a colossal success that it birthed the modern comic book movie renaissance and actually shifted the culture. Coming up on Serial at Midnight, we take a look back at the movie that started it all. Guys, what's going on? Hello and welcome to Serial at Midnight. My name is Heath, and in this episode we're talking about 1989's Batman, directed by Tim Burton and starring Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson, Kim Basinger. Let's start with Tim Burton. Audiences at the time would have known him for Pee-wee's Big Adventure and for Beetlejuice with Michael Keaton. Beetlejuice is a dark fantasy. It's got horror elements, but it's mostly a comedy. Nothing in his resume would have suggested that he was the guy to helm this massive franchise, this tentpole series that would go on to become the face of 90s blockbuster excess, right? With one of Warner Brothers' most iconic characters. It's a relatively small movie, we should say. It's not a huge swing, though it would be a culture-changing success, as I said in the intro to this video. The success of this movie is the stuff of legend. Tim Burton really brings his gifts to this. It's great. It's great direction and a great choice for a director in Warner Brothers hiring Tim Burton, because they see what he does with Beetlejuice, which just create a world, just creates a world whole cloth from the mind. Same with Pee-wee's Big Adventure, really. You get a lot of Paul Reubens there, but he's creating these worlds that really just you saturate yourself in. And everybody's eager to return Batman to these darker comic book origins. Now, on screen, live action, there had been serials, in the 40s. There had been animation, but live action, we're really talking about the 1966 Adam West series. That's what audiences associated with Batman. So camp, jokey, colorful, fun. But of course, as much as I love that, and I do love the Adam West series, I grew up with that series as so many of us did, it's not the truest representation of Batman. And so all these creators return him to those origins, those pulp late 30s, early 40s stories of the comics, where he is a creature of the night seeking vengeance, saw his parents gunned down in front of him when he was just a boy, and of course he vows revenge on those who would seek to hurt others. You've got these dark motivations, but you've also got this nobility. And Michael Keaton, also not your usual suspect, because Michael Keaton in the 80s was coming off of, yes, Beetlejuice was, again, as a showcase for Michael Keaton, but not a dark, dramatic performance. It's more of a comedy performance. And then he's Mr. Mom, right? He'd been a stand-up comedian. Audiences associated him with comedy. And you see this a lot, is when he was cast, there was a lot of backlash, I guess. Now, there was no Twitter at the time, but there was still a lot of press about, is this the best choice? What an interesting, unconventional take. And of course, we've been there and done that now. Robert Pattinson was controversial. When they cast Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, people were like, no way. But of course, can you imagine anybody else being Iron Man? What a perfect bit of casting. And Michael Keaton, for me, is the perfect bit of casting. And though we've had many movies since, Michael Keaton remains my Batman. Because it's a small production, under $50 million, it is a smaller movie. It's a stage-bound movie. If you watch this, you just start noticing how set-bound everything is. Later Christopher Nolan and Matt Reeves, they would open up Gotham City so it becomes like Chicago, right? You've got the elevated trains, you've got the massive skyscrapers. It's a very populated, living city. This Batman movie is dealing primarily with miniatures, model work, matte paintings to flesh this thing out, to make it very stylized. It looks like a painting most of the time because a lot of it is a painting. And what's not a painting is what they've built on set. So you've got this one soundstage, right? You've got this you got the Monarch Theater. You've got the steps of the City Hall building. It's just this one area. It's like this one town square. And if you watch the movie, they just keep coming back to the same area over and over again because that's what they had. Now, they would open it up a little bit. This driving scene, Batmobile scenes where they're out in the countryside. As he's headed to the Batcave, that iconic scene where they're cruising along the leaves and the trees. A very Tim Burton scene. But it's a very small movie, relatively speaking. And the success of this movie, I mean, you guys, this movie made over $400 million. It was an absolutely huge hit. And Jack Nicholson actually, maybe he foresaw this coming, because to be in this movie, his traditional asking price at that time was $10 million. And he cut his rate to $6 million to be in this movie, with a back-end deal that would give him a percentage of the movie's profits. The estimates, I've seen $60 to $90 million. I understand it's probably closer to 90. To this day, one of the most legendary deals in Hollywood. Something this movie does is it's sort of an origin story, but it's not the typical origin story as we would come to know. It's not the Batman Begins origin story, but this movie begins with basically he's just kind of started. He's still a rumor to the criminals of Gotham. Commissioner Gordon hasn't even seen him yet. We first have that interaction between Batman at the Axis chemical plants, where the Joker is born at the beginning of the movie. What's that in of itself? The special effects makeup, having a prosthetic mouth for Joker, for Jack Nicholson, and having it be like a scar, a bad surgery. That was revolutionary at the time too. But Commissioner Gordon sees Batman for the first time in that scene. So he's just starting. They don't have the bat signal yet. And Kim Basinger's character, Vicky Vale, is brought in because she wants to capture pictures of the Batman. She's a photojournalist who has won awards for her work on the Corto Maltese. She's brought that to Gotham City. Now she wants to capture the Batman. So she's not a damsel in distress. She's got a reason for being there. The Batman has a reason for what he's trying to do. And then because we get the origin of the Joker, it's almost more the Joker's movie than it is Batman's movie, because it's the Joker that we get the origin for. And he's kind of the thing that drives the whole film. Batman is reactionary through the movie, and the Joker is the force that propels it. So it's an interesting script setup. Something else that this movie does that we've never really seen before is the gadgets. So we've got, the bat grapple gun, and that he can shoot and fire off at things. We've got the line launcher, basically, so he can swing from across a room. We've got the new Batmobile. The Batmobile in this movie was huge. To this day, probably my favorite Batmobile. It's just so sleek and stylized and angular, but also smooth. It's very Bat-like. And then Danny Elfman's score just accentuates I'm telling you guys, when I hear that Danny Elfman Batman march and it really kicks in, dun 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 dun, dun, that is cinema magic. That score has overshadowed every Batman movie that has come out since. They would basically adapt it for the cartoon, for Batman the Animated Series later in the 90s. One of the best, most famous pieces of music that I can think of. And talking about the dark score and the dark approach to this movie, Batman does do some things here that I, as an older Batman fan, I question. This is a Batman that kills. Now, Batman in the golden age of comics in the 30s, the 40s, he did occasionally kill people. Later, as this evolves, they kind of have Batman sticking to a code where he doesn't take a life. Because to take a life, he would be in the same position as, he'd be the same as the people that killed his parents. He'd be a murderer. He does not want to do that. That's the line Batman doesn't cross. But he does cross that line in this movie. But even that is kind of vague, because it happens a few times in the movie. There's one scene where the Batmobile drives into Axis Chemicals, drops a bomb in the middle of the factory, and there's people all around. They're coming up and they're like, it's the Batmobile, and the bomb blows up and of course kills all the people. And then the Batmobile drives out and we find out that he wasn't even in it. So you could be like, well, he didn't know. Batman didn't know that there were people in there, but he's Batman. Of course he knew there were people in there. There's a scene later towards the climax of the movie when Batman is in the Bat plane. By the way, shout out to that one scene where Batman's in the Bat plane and he eclipses. He goes above the clouds and he rises up to the moon, and there's just the split-second silhouette of the Bat symbol. Absolutely iconic stuff. But there's the scene where the Bat plane is assaulting the Joker as the Joker's standing in front of the cathedral, and he's straight up shooting him. He's trying to kill him. But he does not succeed. But his intention seems to have been to murder the Joker. And then finally, in the belfry of the cathedral, where the bell is, a thug assaults. By the way, another nod to the classic series. All the Joker's thugs are wearing like Joker jackets with patches of the Joker's face on them. So campy. This guy assaults Batman, and Batman throws him down the shaft of the Batman, like hundreds of feet is what it looks like, and he kills that guy for sure. No question about it. So I struggle with some of that stuff. I also struggle with some of I'm going to be honest with you guys, the Prince music. Prince is the coolest. Rest in peace, Prince. Just the best. Probably the greatest Super Bowl halftime show of all time. But the music in this movie is so ostentatious. It was cool in 1989, but these things don't always age well. And now we've got the Joker breaking into a museum with a big ghetto blaster of Prince blasting out of those speakers as they're spray painting art and stuff like that. And even the end credits, we get the great Batman, the Danny Elfman music, and then that goes away and we get a Prince song about, it's very like sexually overt in its message. Like, what does this have to do with the Batman again? But that was the time, and this movie remains a time capsule of when it was created. And, of course, not perfect, because nothing is perfect, but when I go back and I watch this movie, it's such a joy to me. The color timing of the movie, I should say this too, the Batman, the first Batman movie is gold and brown and yellow and very black, natural colors. And then of course later, that doesn't stay the same. We'll talk about that in coming installments, but the very specific choice, very earthy tones here. And then you marry that to the mix of dark and campy. You got Jack Nicholson doing his Jack Palance, but it's like, Bob, you, just Tracy Walter, shout out to Tracy Walter, you are my number one guy. What a weird choice for this movie, but it somehow works. So what do you guys think about Batman from 1989? If you were there, then there's probably nothing else like it in your life. I mean, I can't overstate how much this shifted the culture. Batman was everywhere. Everyone had Bat fever. Everyone was talking about it in a way that doesn't exist now because we're so spread out. We've got streaming. You can just focus on whatever you love. But in 1989, there was one culture, and all of that culture was saturated with Batman. So a few years later, the team comes back together and we get Batman Returns, which is a very different experience. But that is a story for another time. Guys, thank you so much. Take care. Until next time, I will catch you later.